What's that sound? It's For Amusement Only, the EM and Bingo Pinball Podcast. Welcome back to For Amusement Only. This is Nick Baldridge. Tonight I have a very special guest, Steve Young from the Pinball Resource. Steve has worked very diligently over many years to bring us high-quality reproduction parts and to stock those necessary items for pinball maintenance and restoration. Steve was kind enough to take time out and speak with me about a variety of topics. I hope you enjoy. Good afternoon, Steve. How are you?
Hey, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing well. Well, let's get started with just a little about you. How did you come into pinball?
I was introduced to pinball probably my junior year in college by a couple of friends that I bummed around with. And prior to that point, I had no recollection or no interaction with pinball, having grown up in New York, which is kind of a poor pinball state. And didn't quite understand it, and it took me a while to kind of play pinball, and I guess I caught the bug from there.
Excellent. And do you remember the first game that you played?
It's a Williams game, Cabaret.
All right. Now, is that one that you ended up owning later on?
No. Cabaret was in the residence hall that we were living in and was being operated by someone who had the concession to put the games in that particular residence hall.
Excellent. So a lot of college students playing the game, obviously. How did it hold up? I mean, did you end up playing that through your senior year as well?
No, these games rotated. They didn't rotate them as often as they should. When we took over the concession, then you started to realize the value of rotating equipment and so forth. So that you brought fresh games to people, and people weren't, they didn't understand the game fully, so it took a while for them to invest enough money to play the game well. So once we started to operate the games, it was we probably rotated games on a monthly or 6-week basis. Wow.
And when did you start operating there?
Well, that would have been 3 or 4 years later. When I graduated. To complete the story, the guys that I was introduced to pinball with ended up taking over the concession probably senior year when this particular student graduated. So he sold the concession for $1, which was the nominal fee, and then these two friends of mine operated it, and that's where we kind of, we rented the equipment. They rented the equipment, and along with that came the keys so that we could start sticking our noses in them and start fiddling around with things. And if we needed a service call and it was something simple, we could do it. And we could make the collection so that somebody didn't decide they would break into the game. And then when one roommate graduated, then I kind of became the partner to have the game there. And I, as a graduate student, John Fetterman and I then ran that game, and we had about a dozen or better locations across campus. We put games in a number of residence halls and fraternities. So I was a player and then quickly an operator.
Yeah, that happened very fast. So what did you study in school?
I went to school for metallurgy and materials engineering.
Excellent. And I assume that served you very well in what you do currently.
It served me well, in my career with IBM, and it served me very well in my career with pinball, because we're involved with material selection and processing materials and things like that on a daily and hourly basis to solve problems or to figure out how things are made or find people to make things or help them solve problems, etc.
That's a very good skill set to have. So what did you do for IBM?
I started with IBM in 1976 with a master's degree. I took a cut and pay from operating pinballs to work for IBM. And I went to work in what was called multi-level ceramic, where they were screening metallurgical inks on unfired ceramics and then stacking them up to make large modules that held up to like 120 integrated chips per module. And so I went to work with them to help develop those screening inks, and then went on to do other things still in the electronics packaging business, but at a higher level of things like the actual packaging, the heat transfer, chip bonding, and so forth. So after about 6 or 7 years there, I became a manager, and then after a couple of first-line manager jobs, I became a second-line manager. So by the time I left in 1992, when they were having their downsizings, I had a project of about 75 people working for me.
Wow. So explain to me how you got into becoming the Pinball Resource in more than just the shop that you run, but in general as well. I mean, you're the guy to call for information, all kinds of very useful information. So how did that happen kind of simultaneously with what was going on with your day job?
Well, I'll answer the question, but you may have to ask the question more than once because there's kind of a lot of different facets and they kind of come together.
Okay.
When I graduated from college, I went to work for IBM. Then I started to import games from Pennsylvania to do home sales. So I wanted to keep my hand in pinball. Oh, by the way, I had 100 games in my collection by then.
Wow.
So, I wasn't really separated from pinball, but I liked the extra income that I got from doing that, and I liked keeping my hands involved and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I brought games from Pennsylvania up here because I was kind of a replay snob. And New York State is an Adaball state, so I thought replay pinball is better than Adaball pinball, and I know that'll cause all kinds of consternation in the community, but that was my belief at the time, and therefore my source of games was, John Fetterman's people and people he knew down in Pennsylvania, and so I used to go down there and haul back 6 or 8 games at a time in my pickup truck, and that was my source of games. Well, I kind of outstripped that. I couldn't get enough games that way. It's too hard to go that distance to haul, games and so forth. So I kind of developed local sources, and I started buying games from local operators. So in about a 50-mile radius, I kept all the used games. I bought up all the used games. So if you went in the phone book and you called an operator to buy a game, they'd say, "Oh, sorry, I don't have any. Call Steve Young." So it's kind of like easy way to create a little bit of a monopoly in your local area.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, my understanding of pinball and everything was, changing and so forth. So, in a home, I realized that the advantages that I thought of winning a free game weren't all that spectacular. So you could win an extra ball and have an extended game, and since you weren't really paying for the game, with money, like by dropping a coin in the game, to get an extended game and so forth, I kind of got my head wrapped around that.
So you warmed up to Adaballs?
I became accepting of Adaball, and an advocate of all pinball. But I don't advocate one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all pinball, so it's all good.
Right.
So I have that going on, and sometime in the late 70s, that's when I met Gordon Hassey, and Gordon kind of introduced me more so to the popular culture part of pinball. So you got a different aspect than just operating or fixing. And we had become aware of things like the traveling pinball exhibition that Wayne Morgan put on at the Regina Public Library up in Saskatchewan, Canada. And I was kind of getting into, the popular culture part of it, the kinetic art part of it, and so forth. And that led to Gordon and I forming Silverball Amusements, which did the Pinball Collectors Quarterly in 81, 82 time frame. So I had that kind of going on, and I was doing that while I still worked at IBM.
Mm-hmm.
I was busy, boy.
It sounds like it. So you're restoring games, you're doing Silverball Amusements, Pinball Collectors Quarterly, and you're working your day job.
Right.
Boy, that's quite a bit. So during this time, that was about the time of the EM to solid state transition. What were your thoughts at the time on that transition?
Not really much of a thought-wise. The games that I was buying for resale were starting to get into the early Gottlieb System 1 games and the early Bally 6800 series games. So I was beginning to, learn how to work on those kinds of machines as kind of a necessity, but we were for a home use, there wasn't much of an advantage to go into solid state versus electromechanical.
Mm-hmm.
I used to explain to customers that a properly reconditioned machine, whether it was a electromechanical or solid state, would be reliable in their house.
Right.
And while the cost of maintaining or fixing a solid state machine would be about double the cost of maintaining an electromechanical game, you would probably see me as half as often. So on the whole, it would average out. And I used to tell people, and I believe from my calculations, that if they dropped a penny and a quarter in a cup every time they pressed the start button, that would cover their maintenance. That was based on, $35 or $40 service call. Mm-hmm. Which today sounds ridiculously inexpensive, but right. I think that was what the traffic would bear in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
And a shop, if we brought the machine into the shop to work on it, that was kind of an automatic $75 charge. Because you had more time involved, and the game usually required more work. Or to finish the discussion of Pinball Resource, I found it difficult to purchase parts to repair the games that I was reconditioning. And I went to normal places like Wico, and I would deal with, I think it was Irving Morris Sales at the time down in New Jersey, who was a Gottlieb distributor. And they were really set up for the commercial guys to buy stuff. And they weren't very friendly to, guy off the street. And I found I couldn't get the parts that I needed, or I needed stuff and I didn't want to wait for it, so I started buying more parts. And then the operators that I was buying the games from, they would call me up. Oh, I need a flipper coil for such and such. Do you have it? Yeah. Oh, can I come get it? Sure, come on over. So they started buying parts from me. Mm-hmm. Because they didn't invest, typical operator, they invested in the game and then kind of ignored it, and then they react to crises. So I'm like, I can't believe you guys. You guys' livelihood depends on the game running, and you have no parts. So I scratched my head, and I kept buying parts. And then I got involved with people like Don Murphy in Chicago and so forth, and we decided that we would start making stuff that we couldn't get. So we started to do that. We started to advertise in Dennis Dodal's Pinball Trader magazine, and Dennis is actually the one who gave us the name.
Oh, excellent.
Gave me the name. Dennis said, "Hey, you're a real pinball resource," and it stuck.
What do you know? It's a small hobbyist world here.
Well, I mean, the number of people that were in the hobby at the time was relatively small.
Yeah.
I've been selling parts and doing mail order stuff since, the late 70s, using a typewriter and, packing stuff in my free time and helping people out that way.
That's incredible. So I was reading, actually, an interview that you did in an issue of Dennis Dodal's Pinball Trader, and
that must have been a long time ago.
1989. So, you had mentioned the Pinball Collectors Quarterly, and it's something that I've read about in the past, and I've never asked you about this when I've called before, but is that something that you still sell?
Yes.
Okay.
We lost a lot of money in Pinball Collectors Quarterly. We had, pretty nice, a decent base. Everything you got to understand, this is before personal computers.
Right.
So, the mailing list was done on 33 up labels and Rolodex cards, and the layout for the magazine was typeset down in Virginia, and then the mechanicals made it. It was all done the old-fashioned way. And after 3 issues, we put out renewal notices, and I'd say half to 2/3 of the people who were subscribing re-upped, and the other half decided that they didn't want to re-up their subscription. So it was kind of like, it's costing us X dollars per magazine to put this out. We're working awful hard to lose money. Let's not continue it. So
sounds sensible.
we stopped the magazine, sent everybody their money back that had sent their money in, and started selling other things like a couple of catalog reprints and back issues of the magazine, and then we made a little bit of money. So
well, good.
The print runs were decent. Rather, you have to run a certain number of copies and so forth. And so, issue 1, we had we had a pretty good run on because we mailed some of those out as a gimme. Here's a magazine. Here's what it looks like. Do you want to subscribe and so forth? So we sent a lot of those out as freebies. And then issues 2, 3, and 4 had like normal print runs. So we still have a lot of issue 1, and I think issue either 2 or 3, and then the other 2 issues, when people need a copy of the magazine, we have to make as a photocopy from the original.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that would be very interesting to read from a historical perspective, especially.
I still read them, and I'm proud of what we did.
Yeah, well, I'll be ordering a set here soon.
I did. Yeah, but you're chief cook and bottle washer. You're doing all the work to maintain the list. You're mailing the stuff out. You're getting the permits from the post office. I did the photography. I had local people that were like photographic students and stuff like that working in their dark rooms as contractors to do, the photos and stuff like that. Gordon was in the advertising business, so he has access to people doing the layouts and everything, and then the layouts would come up to me, and I had a local printer here that was very good that actually printed it here in Poughkeepsie, and I would go pick them up. So you're doing lots of different kinds of jobs.
Meanwhile, managing sales and just all kinds of things that you're doing.
Doing all kinds of other things. Sure. Yeah, when you're young, you can do everything.
Right. So, in that interview, you had mentioned that the definitive repair manual still hadn't been written, and you were considering doing something about that. Is that something that you're still considering?
I don't know, off and on. There were a number of efforts that have been done to gather a lot of information together into either books or today online. I could make a career out of just contributing information. You can, and yet I see lots of people joining the hobby or whatever, and they don't go research the information that's available. They go out on a news group, or they go on to, some kind of electronic medium, and they just ask a question: how do I fix this? And it's, that's covered over here. How do I fix this? How do I fix that? They don't go look at the sources that are out there some are very good and getting better by the day. If I had nothing else to do, I could just document pinball. There's that much that's not documented or pulled together.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about, especially with the proliferation of all these digital sources, like you say, that there's that much. But you're right. I mean, a lot of people don't.
But this was a major industry. If you look at the quantity of games that were made, and you look at, this was not a hobby. People made big businesses out of this.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the production quantities. You look at the quantities of games that were being made per day, and it's astounding.
Absolutely.
And you look at it. And I look at I'm sitting here with the Gottlieb archives here. There's 36,000 blueprints here. Wow. That's part number 1 to when they closed in 1995. That's 10,000 pounds of paper sitting in filing cabinets. Every from A-size drawing up to F-size drawings that cover a wall. Just to digitize all that stuff would be a career.
Yeah.
Stuff was all done, up until the late 70s. Everything was on paper and pencil.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the letters come from in your part numbers.
Right.
A part number beginning with an A is on a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper, which is called an A-size drawing. And a B is on an 11 by 17, and so forth. So when you see the part number, you know which filing cabinet to go to retrieve the drawing.
Huh. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Williams did the same thing. They started out with 1A, and they put into the part number, they put in the type of part it was. So a 1, which became 01 once they digitized, a 1 is a stamping. When you're done with it, it's just a stamping. You're done with it. If it's an 02, it was a turned metal part. It's not an assembly, it's a turned metal part. So if it comes out of the lathe and you might plate it or whatever, and it's done, that's an 02 part. And an 03 part was a molded plastic part. So it popped out of the mold, you're done with it. If you had to stamp it or attach something to it, then it became an assembly and it got a different kind of a number. But by knowing how the number is assigned, you can know something about the part. Daddy East has the same thing. 545 is a molded plastic part. 515 is an assembly. 535, 530 is a turned part. So the prefix that they built into the numbering system helps you understand the nature of the part.
Interesting. That's very helpful.
It took a long time to figure that out. I mean, it sounds so simple today.
Well, when you explain it to me, yeah. But yeah, that's something, in looking at parts catalogs, I've never even picked up on. So,
right. Motors are categorized under this number. Gottlieb didn't do that. They just put straight part numbers. So the part number in a Gottlieb doesn't tell you anything about the part except to go get the drawing and see what it is. But other people did things differently.
And do you have any insight as to why Gottlieb might not have set theirs up that way?
No.
No? Okay. Fair enough.
They did it the way they did it. Somebody else thought about it differently, and they didn't copy anything. They did it a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Bally did it another way. They all had their, somebody had a method, and you just followed the method.
Fair enough.
And then once you set things kind of up in concrete, you kind of don't mess with them.
Right.
I've got part numbers here that I assigned back in 92 when I started to computerize, and I got the number wrong. I got the letter in front of the part wrong. Guess what? I can't delete it. We just live with it. We know that part starting with a C starts with an A when you talk with Pinball Resource. That's whoops, but it's kind of cast in concrete.
Yeah, I mean, once it's done, I guess it's done. So, well, going back a ways, what was the first game that you picked up for your own collection?
Well, the first two games I bought, one was a Williams Palisades and one was a United game that I don't remember sitting here. And I bought them when I was a senior in college. And I bought them with my friend's help. By then I had, senior year you could have a car, so I had a station wagon, and we could become a little bit dangerous. And John helped me fix the game. It turned out somebody had swapped the transformer from one into the other and vice versa. So the only thing wrong with the Palisades was the fact that it had the wrong transformer in it, therefore the wrong voltage. So when I went out to the car where the other game was and I took the transformer out of it, we put it back the way it was supposed to be, presto changeo, got a working game. I stuck it in a section lounge.
Mm-hmm.
7 balls for a nickel because it was a 1951 or 2 game, and this was 1974, so it wasn't the most modern machine, and I was killing it with nickels.
Wow!
I was nicking into their business downstairs. It almost caused a war.
Wow!
I still have Palisades. I would have to go back to my card file and tell you what the other game was, but the other game not in my collection anymore.
Gotcha. In that interview, a lot of my notes come from that. You mentioned that Four Corners is one of your favorites, and that game is particularly interesting to me because I like the bingo machines,
mm-hmm.
and that's one of those odd hybrids that Williams made for a short time.
Right.
What's your thought of that game?
I love it. I love the game because the game is integrated with both the artwork and the concept.
Mm-hmm.
If you get 3 in a line or 4 in line, you get a fair number of replays. But if you get the 4 corners in the grid, you get 20 replays. And it's got artwork showing you the 4 corners in a bucolic scene. So it's a really interesting tie between the object of the game and the artwork on the machine.
I think that game is particularly beautiful.
And I recently, I haven't been buying many. I've been trying to dwindle my collection, but locally I was offered Williams Disc Jockey, which is the next game.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also got I'll call it a bingo card in the corner. I think it's smaller than, I think it's one row narrower or whatever. And that game, very similar, but has a very interesting come on. You in this time period, you see Gottlieb had the double award, where if you put a second nickel in, you could double your awards.
Right.
This game, if you accomplish a reasonably simple goal on the playfield, the light comes on and says, double award next game. So after you finish the game and you got that light lit, you're going to be reaching into your pocket for another nickel because now you're playing a double and you only paid for a single.
Interesting.
I just think that's a very novel approach to
fishing that extra
get
nickel out.
Somebody to
Yeah.
play again.
Mm-hmm.
Cough up some more change.
What are your thoughts on Hong Kong, which was another in that series?
It's a good game. I have had only pieces of a Hong Kong. I don't think I ever had a complete game, and whatever I had, I've sold.
Gotcha. What's the oldest game that you've repaired or restored in your time collecting?
I have a Redgrave's Parlor Bagatelle, which is, 1870-something?
Mm-hmm.
I've had two of them. Bought at different times. I sold one. I have one that's, I think, in Jersey City that's different than the Philadelphia or whatever the other label was. It came in a box, a wooden box, a hinged cover box. I bought it at an auction. I've had it a lot of years. And I've worked on 30s games and so forth, and I understand them historically, and I have a appreciation that they helped us get to where we are. But my real interest is after we got flippers in 47, 48.
Gotcha. Yes. So, from my understanding, you have a beautiful wood rail collection. What are some of your favorite players from that era?
Whatever I'm playing at the time. Isn't that how a wine collector says, what's your favorite wine? They go, oh, the one that's in my glass.
Yeah.
I haven't played them all. And I've been discovering them. I've either played them a long time ago and don't remember how they played, or I haven't played them at all, and in the process of restoring them, I get a chance to live with a game and play it a while before I put it in the row and then work on the next one. A couple of years ago, I decided that I'd better get busy and start restoring some of my games. So I made room in my shop so that there's one game under the knife all times. And as you walk by it, you have time and you work on it a little bit here and a little bit there. You got a couple hours and you work on it. So I've been getting about a game done a month. Now I've run out of space to set them up. I find all of them have something interesting on them. And what I find interesting about the 50s games is because it was really a time of experimentation and kind of rapid development of play mechanics and features on play fields and things like that. So some of these games have things that work and some things that they tried once and don't work. But that's one of that plus the artwork and everything is why I really concentrate my collecting in the 1950s and the games that I've been restoring in the first half of the 1950s. So I've been really concentrating on 1950, 51, 52, 53, 54, and 55 kind of games. Now I run out of space. I don't know how I'm going to approach it. I have to pick my battles. I'm currently working on Gottlieb Barnacle Bill.
That's a beautiful game.
Which I think I played when I got it from Gordon. It kind of worked, and I then set it on end in my garage for the next 30 years, and now it doesn't work, and I have to go through it. So storage never improved anything.
It's funny how that works.
But I've got set up and really like Casey Jones,
mm-hmm.
and I like Crossroads, and I like Chinatown, and I like Coronation, and I like Queen of Hearts, and Flying High, and I've got a Poker Face setup that I really enjoy, and I've got Pinwheel up. I've got Green Pastures up. It's a tough game. Lovely Lucy is up. Mystic Marvel, Jockey Club. I got a whole bunch of games set up. Some of them are very tough games to play, but you can see from the wear on them they got played.
Mm-hmm.
So people like those games. Whether I like them or not, I don't know.
That's part of the fun of restoration, right? It's getting to
right.
see. Yeah.
Yeah, and you get to understand how the features work and how one game might have led to the other, and they did certain things for a certain while, and then they changed.
Yeah, that's the beauty of looking.
Helps me answer a lot of questions. Somebody calls, I'm working on such. Oh yeah, I just did one of those. What do you want to know? Well, I'm wondering if such and such. Oh yeah, it works this way, and I get to I don't remember. I'll go look at my game and tell you.
Well, that's excellent. So, what are your thoughts on multiplayer games?
In general, I don't like them.
And with EMs specifically, is there?
Yeah, it's an EM thing, and it has to do with a number of things. Number one, in their earliest manifestation, when player one turned some kind of feature on but didn't collect it, player two, who might be the poorest pinball player in the world, can collect that bonus or collect that 100-point bumper and then shut it off for you. So you have to start all over to light it up again, and then you lose your ball but don't get the advantage of it, and then they collect it again. It's very frustrating. So that's one of the drawbacks. The major drawback to an electromechanical multiplayer is that the objective of the game has to be simple enough to achieve it in a different environment. When you play a single-player game, you have 5 balls to work toward an objective, so the objective tends to be more complex, or you have multiple objectives. When you have a multiplayer game, light A, B, and C for extra ball. That's it. Or instead of getting 15 drop targets down, you need to get one bank or the other bank down, and then some feature lights up. And then you lose the ball and the game resets, and you get to do that simple objective all over again. Whereas in a single-player game, you have a more complex objective. Now, there are exceptions to this. Williams tried a game called 8 Ball in 1966, where they put a double bank in the game. Mm-hmm. If you ever pick one of those games up, your arms will fall out of your sockets. But it's basically 2 single players in one cabinet. So mm-hmm. each player then has their own 5-ball game to get the objective. They did it, I think, as an experiment. Steve Kordak says, it costs too much, we'll never do that again.
Yeah, I can believe that, doubling all the steppers.
And, yeah. Well, it doesn't double the steppers, it doubles the bank that's keeping control, keeping track of your pull rack or,
Yeah, your trip bank.
And so forth.
Right.
And you had that in your first solid-state games. It isn't until you get to, like, strikes and spares where Bally put memory in. So the playfield, from that point on, becomes 4 single-player games in one cabinet. So then your objectives change.
So the disadvantage kind of disappears at that point.
Yeah, and the other thing that I have comment that I have going against multiplayer games is that if you get 4 guys to play pinball on a game that's got 4 players, one of them is always invariably better than the other 3.
Mm-hmm.
And you're waiting for your turn. Somebody is going to be a hog. Not intentionally, but they're going to, you lose interest. You're standing around waiting for these other 3 people, one of whom might be, a really superior player or a very lucky player, to finish his ball. And then it's your turn again. You're kind of out of the playing mode. You kind of got to get gassed up again.
Yeah, I understand that
So,
completely.
when you talk about games for home game rooms, and people, they got kids and everything. They don't have the patience level to wait.
Mm-hmm.
So when people talk to you about what should I get, I find you can talk to them about a pinball like this, but you can also say, well, if you bought a shuffle alley,
Mm-hmm.
you're throwing one or two pucks very rapidly, and the rotation of the players happens to keep everybody's interest in a competitive mode. Because nobody can monopolize the game. If you throw one puck and get a strike, your turn's up. Next player. If you throw a second puck to get your spare, it still doesn't take long. So you haven't lost that competitive nature, and you haven't lost people's attention.
Right. So one thing that you had mentioned, again, I'm referring to this interview from almost 30 years ago now, but
yeah, boy, I begin to feel old here.
You had mentioned that you're collecting serial numbers. Is that something that you're still doing personally?
No, I turned that over. When I approached things, I was raised in a house collecting antiques and doing research on genealogies of people who made things and so forth. So I've always had a historical approach to things, to understand how things are today, to look back and see. And one of the questions that we always had was how many of each game was made. And no one would tell you. The factories their lips were sealed. For whatever reasons, they wouldn't release production data, either for competitive reasons or whatever. So one of the ways we thought we could get to the bottom of that is to start collecting serial numbers, and then start doing additions and subtractions, and get an idea of range of serial numbers, and also you get survivorship. If you had an idea that they made 1,000 games and you've got so many games reported, you obviously don't have everything reported. Then you can start looking at other games and see how many might be out there and how many may have survived. I did it for quite a few years, and I turned it over to Larry Biza. I can't tell you the year. Larry carried it forward, and then Larry, I think, turned it over to the people that do it online. So some of that information ended up on the online, serial database.
Good.
It gave us an idea, but we never could get enough information. This is the days before the internet, so we couldn't. What you gathered was people writing you notes or telling you over the phone, sending you a fax or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What we could never determine is where a serial number might have started. Did Gottlieb go to the next 1,000 number, or did they start a certain game with, we know that in the 70s they started with serial number 1,000. They never started with serial number 1. Well, it takes you a while to figure out. You don't have any serial numbers below 1,000, so they must have started at 1,000, 1001, 1002. In the 50s, they had letter and number combinations, and they added letters after a while, so each model number got a different letter, but the serial numbers were somewhat contiguous, but they must have skipped to another, let's say an even 1,000, when they started a new game.
Mm-hmm.
And when they did a sample run, are the sample numbers buried in the production numbers for the game 6 months before it came out, or are they in the current numbers? Did they set them ahead? You have to figure out all these things.
So one of the concepts that you mentioned there was survivorship, and in the interview you also mentioned extinct machines. Are there some titles that you know, or that you suspect, at least, off the top of your head, that might be extinct games?
Yeah, there are extinct games. You know, when I look at let's say the Gottlieb serial number base, or I look at their production list, you see games that weren't produced. You know, like 10 Little Indians or Route 66,
Mm-hmm.
or they made a little baseball game called Bush League. You know, there was another one called Ricochet. Well, I have a production photo of Ricochet. I know that they made one game. Does it ever show up in anybody's basement or collection? I don't know. Bush League, Herb Silvers found one. He said, "I know why they didn't make it. It doesn't work right." He made it work to the best of what it did when it was new for his customer.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't keep a project file. You know, all the bills of material and everything that I've got, I can tell you, what parts are in what game and so forth, but where the game wasn't issued, they don't have a folder. So at some point they tossed it out, or at some point they decided we're not going to preserve a record of what we didn't make. And I'm sure the same is for Williams as well. I don't know it as intimately. There are games that were made that they made, some samples of and tested it. They said, no, it's not going to fly. Don't make it. For whatever reason that they had. Or we have something better we want to do, forget about it.
Steve, when most people think of you, they think Gottlieb. You're kind of synonymous with Gottlieb parts and so forth. But of course, you supply for any kind of machine. My question to you as a collector, you obviously collect a lot of Gottlieb wood rails, as we've been talking about here. What are your thoughts on Bally EM machines and Williams?
Well, when I decided to, about 6 or so years ago, my collecting partner, John Fetterman, and I, when we closed the business from operating at school, when I graduated with my master's degree, John went back to working at the park up at Knoebels, and he and I had a number of games in our collection together, and we decided to keep that going. And that survived until about 6 or 7 years ago, when John decided that he wanted to retire from collecting. So at that point, I bought him out and moved the games to New York that were in storage down in Pennsylvania, and I put heads and bases together and made some tough decisions about how many games I had, reasonable hopes for enjoying. I was on the high side of 200 games at that point. I have sold off about half of that. A little here and a little there quietly. Games as is,
Mm-hmm.
Restored and so forth. I made a decision to concentrate on Gottlieb because of the amount of information that I had. But at that point, when I made that decision, I had about half of the 50s Williams. And we used to rejoice when we found a Williams wood rail, because Williams only made about a third of what Gottlieb did.
Wow.
So the numbers, if Gottlieb was making 1,000, 1,500 games, 850, 1,400, Williams is making 500, 350, 700. So there are fewer games to start with, there are fewer games to find. So when we found a Williams wood rail, we were actually happier than when we found a Gottlieb wood rail, because they were that much harder to find. So I have a great appreciation for Williams wood rails. People like Harry Mabs, who was designing at Gottlieb, went to Williams in the late 40s, and the games that he designed for Williams would have been the ones he would have made for Gottlieb, because it was him, the designer.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a real appreciation for the games of that time period. The art was different, but it was a different, it was George Malenton doing the artwork instead of, Parker.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still, great artwork. The games were very interesting. I simply made a decision based on how much space I could devote, what I thought I could accomplish. And, just storing the games is not what I wanted.
You want to be able to enjoy them, right?
Yeah. The 60s games I own in my collection, I still have a Slick Chick, and I had a couple other 60s games. They've been sold off except for the Slick Chick. I just gravitated toward the wood rail games. So my involvement in the 60s was more for buy and sell, recondition, than it was to keep. There are some terrific Williams, almost all the inverted wedge head Williams games are fantastic players.
I agree.
And there are other games, that are great players. But they never had as much focus from me. I've had some of them, but they've all kind of gone along. Bally, you don't run into too much. You never ran into it very much in my circles. We never found a lot of Bally 60s games.
Well, there was that huge gap where they were only producing bingos. So
they only made like 3 or 4 games in the 50s.
Yeah.
And they re-entered the business in like 62 or about then. That was their kind of re-entry into pinball, and the first game was kind of a copy of a Gottlieb game.
Mm-hmm.
And you find they just never ran in the circles that I was running in. If you kind of stop and analyze patterns, I always look for patterns. You'll find, let's say you're in the middle of Wisconsin, in a town that's 100 miles from everything else, and you're driving around and you see everybody in this town drives a Ford. You kind of go, my God, why is that? Well, there's only one car dealer in town. It was a Ford dealer. And if you wanted to buy a Chevy, you had to go 100 miles. So people didn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you have the same kind of thing with the distributors. The distributors that distributed pinball games many times financed the operators. So if you had a strong distributor, that distributor could get a lot of product out because he was lending money to the operators so they'd buy his equipment. So if you had a distributor that was dominant in a certain market, you'd see a lot of games like that in that area. You see, for instance, in Michigan, you see lots of classic Stern games, because there was a large distributor that supported that brand. You had the same kind of stuff, like say in Philadelphia, where you had just giant Gottlieb distributor, and they kind of owned that town. I don't think I've ever collected games in an area that was maybe had a strong Bally distributor, so I never got a chance to buy a lot of Bally games.
Makes perfect sense.
Does that kind of make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
It's like you hear about United games down in like Georgia. Well, there's a big distributor of United games down in Georgia. We don't. You play a United game and you kind of, oh yeah, they kind of like all play alike. And they aren't very interesting to play because they didn't have lots of different features, and a lot of them have almost the same playfield layout. But people in that area, that was what they knew, because that was their strong distributor was a United distributor.
Yeah, and that's an interesting concept too with United, and also with Bally in some of the games that they made, where they did a lot more similar than different. And I wonder if the theory was that players would be less confused, or what the thought would have been.
I don't think they ever got that deep.
Okay.
I don't think the distributor ever got that deep.
Well, not the distributor, but the manufacturer.
No, I don't know. You kind of play to where your strengths are, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I watched, you watch, like Capcom try to break into the pinball business in the mid '90s, and they had a real problem that you couldn't find a good distributor. So if somebody took on the brand, the game was in the back room and wasn't up front. Or Williams was going through one of these things where they didn't want their distributors to handle anybody else's games. Well, if Williams is the dominant distributor out on the street, and they just said, hey, you guys can't carry Gottlieb, or you can't carry Stern, or you can't carry Capcom, you just relegated anybody trying to start out to a secondary distributorship who doesn't have the infrastructure built up. And that was going on.
Yeah.
There was only one distributor that managed to keep Williams in another brand, and I think that was in Baltimore. And he told Williams no. But a lot of distributors,
wow.
Decided that they liked Williams and they liked their relationship with Williams, so they kind of de-emphasized or dropped the other brands.
Well, yeah, it's hard to.
Williams wanted to be exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
They want to own the market. So there's a lot of very interesting things that could be written and researched about the business of pinball.
Mm-hmm.
Not the making of games and the play development and so forth, but the business of pinball.
Yeah, that's something I know nothing about, so I'd be very
that was
interested.
something I had hoped, when we did the pinball encyclopedias with Dick Buchel. Dick was an industrial historian. Appreciation for all kinds of stuff, but an industrial historian. And he was digging into that kind of stuff, and I had hoped that, we would have been able to finish that set of volumes to be able to present that stuff, and I would have read them to learn what I could learn. I mean, the stuff that I'm sure he would tell me that I didn't know.
That would have been very interesting.
Maybe someday that'll happen. We have all his records.
Well, that's good.
But putting pen to paper and on a project like that is a lifetime of work.
Yeah, it's daunting, probably, to say the
yes.
least. So.
Yeah, and it's not a job you can. Oh, I got 5 minutes. Let me write a paragraph. No, you can't do that. You got to get your head. You got to go someplace for a week and not have the phone or the internet or whatever bother you, and you got to immerse yourself in it.
So, Steve, just out of curiosity, what do you think of the resurgence of pinball as a hobby from the digital perspective? There's a lot of people that play the Pinball Arcade, which has licensed Gottlieb tables in it. What are your thoughts on that as kind of a gateway to actual pinball?
Well, there's lots of gateways to pinball. I don't think the hobby has ever subsided. I have seen the hobby grow continuously, regardless of how the business was doing commercially. I've seen the hobby grow continuously every year that I can be aware of, that I have a business measure of. Let's put it that way. There's new people that pop up, and some of them go on to own one game and that's it. Some people become addicted and own 50 games, and some people become promoters of shows and go on to give back to pinball that way. Some people find another aspect of the hobby, and maybe they become manufacturers of a game. Not everyone who comes to the hobby, develops, the same way.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember working with people, hours on the phone, teaching them how to read schematics. And finally the light bulb goes on and they catch fire. And they go on, and that person went on to run a very successful show for 17 or 18 years and benefited pinball by making it more popular. And, it was great. I didn't help him. I didn't help him read schematics so that he could turn into a good show promoter. I helped him because he needed to know. I've helped other people on the phone for hours, and they fix one game and they're done with pinball. That's the luck of the draw.
Now, do you have anything to do with the approval process for those digital recreations?
No.
Okay, that's Gottlieb.
I'm a humble licensee of Gottlieb.
Right.
With in the exclusive area of parts and remaking parts, and if I wanted to make a game, I'd have to go back to them and get my license expanded. And if I wanted to do something like, hats or mugs, or digital, whatever, I would have to go and expand my license.
Gotcha.
I think it all adds to the enjoyment of pinball. I mean, people played some of the early computer pinball games and then decided they wanted to, play the hardware. I'm a hardware guy. I'm not a software kind of a guy brain. I mean, I'm a nuts and bolts kind of guy. Some people call us gearheads. I'm into making stuff and making stuff work, and that's my interest. That's enough challenge, I think.
I would agree. I work with software all day, so getting to work with the hardware of pinball is, my relaxation. That's my favorite thing to do.
Good.
So, I have a quick story for you. One of the first times I called you up, just as an example of what a resource you are, I called you up and said, I'm working on this game, and I've troubleshot this problem, and I think I need this part. And you told me very quickly, no, you don't. And you said, go back and look at it again, because you most likely don't need this part. You need something else. More than likely, I don't know exactly what you need, but go take another look. And you were totally right. Of course.
I'm not always right.
No, but in this case, you
absolutely. But it's not my first rodeo in many
exactly.
of these things.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to put that story out there because it shows just what a great resource you are. Picking up the phone and being able to talk to you, present you with the parts that you need, and then your interest is not in purely moving a bunch of parts. Your interest is in keeping machines alive.
Yeah, I have one of the questions I've learned to ask, and it's not just in pinball but in life, is what problem are you trying to solve?
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes people can get so close to something they can't see the overall problem. So I try to make people back off a little bit. Say, what problem are you trying to solve? And then when they tell me what problem they solve, I can kind of lead them to approaching the problem a little bit differently. And I don't sell certain parts because they don't need them. But I think from a business standpoint and a hobby standpoint, it's the right thing to do.
Right.
I would rather put the extra energy up front to say, you don't need that flipper coil. You need to go look at your end-of-stroke switch. Or you need to look at the return spring. And maybe you don't need any parts. Than it is to sell somebody a part that you have doubt about. And then they call you up in 3 days when they got their package. It didn't solve the problem. I want to send it back. I can't base my business on other people's lack of knowledge.
Right.
That's something I can't do. So I invest that extra time. It takes people aback a little bit. They got to get over that hump. They hang up the phone and go, he wouldn't help. Yeah, I helped you. Go look at it again.
Yeah.
And then they'll call you the next day, and now the doubt's out of it. You're right. I need this. That's what I suspected. Okay, let's get you set up with that. And, oh, you probably need this too. Yeah, how did you know? Well, I just know. All right? But I've avoided trouble. It's kind of like measuring twice and cutting once.
Right.
It helps. And once you get over that hump, then there's a bond here where they know that I'm not going to take advantage of them. When they need something and I act as a backstop, they need something, they know that I have their best interest in mind. And I think that's important.
I agree.
And it's different than the way the world seems to work today.
Yes.
But I work the old-fashioned way, and that's the way I work. And we try to, when I see a problem looming, I try to avoid the problem if I can. I've had people call me up and say, I have, such and such a problem. And I go, oh, yeah, that game? Yeah, look at about the third relay back on the right. It's labeled such and such, and look for such and such. 10 minutes later, that person's back on the phone, cursing a blue stream. I said, what's the matter? He goes, I worked on that for 2 weeks, and you fixed it in 10 seconds. I said, yeah, I know. Sorry. I said, but I learned from you. I learned the same thing. I get people, I work through a problem with them on the phone. I go, I don't know if I got it or not. Would you call me back and tell me what it was? So I learned from that. A lot of customers, you'll hear from them, they won't call you in an hour and say, it was this. But the next time they place an order, oh, you remember I was working on such and such? It turned out that you didn't give me the right answer, but you led me in the right direction, so the problem turned out to be this. I said, oh, good. Okay, I can start that away in my memory bank. The next time somebody has that problem, I can give them maybe two options, and one of them is right.
Yeah, that's...
So it's, I learn every day. I get to teach, and I get to learn.
I just think that's the best thing in the world. So.
Otherwise, I'd get bored.
Yeah.
I gotta keep doing new things. We take on new challenges. We make new parts. You take on new processes. You take on new problems. You kind of gotta move forward, or you stand in place.
So, with talking about parts and Pinball Resource, on your website, which is pbresource.com, and I'll put that in the notes for anybody who might need that and hasn't called Steve. There's a news page which lists some of the new parts that you make once they come to market. And those Bally Spring Kits for steppers, thank you for making those.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a scattershot. Mm-hmm. I like to be precise, but Bally's kind of difficult to work with as a company, as a manufacturer. They were concentrate. They came from, let's say, arcade roots and bingo roots, where they were really focusing on making their games bulletproof. Mm-hmm. Because money was involved. So if you look at a bingo game, the quality of the construction and the design of the circuit is far better than a pinball. You drop your dime in the game and the game screws you, you lost a dime. You go get a dime back, right? Mm-hmm. If you got a few dollars invested in getting the bingo game set up the way it's supposed to, and it's supposed to pay you 300 games, and you got 5 instead of 300, you got an issue. You got a lot more money riding on it. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
So they came to pinball with that type of precision, and I think it's too much precision necessary for pinball. It kind of makes working on Bally games in the 60s very difficult because they brought that mindset with them. So if you look at the design of a bingo game, they designed each relay. The coil for that relay is designed with just the right amount of pull based on how many blades are being pulled in by that coil. Mm-hmm. So that if someone were to monkey around with the line cord and, let's say, try to drop the line voltage to make a certain relay drop out so you could cheat the game, they designed it so that all the relays would drop at the same time. So you might have a series of 5 or 6 different coils, and they might be different by, let's say, 50 or 100 turns.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't. But if you go to a pinball machine where you don't need that kind of protection, those coils might all be interchangeable for a pinball application, and yet they all have different part numbers. And you have the same thing with their springs, I think. I kind of studied a lot of parts catalogs, and I looked at a lot of spring numbers, and I tried to select a few springs that would cover the basis. Because I think to put the 5 or 6 springs together that I needed to do those kits is probably around $3,000 worth of springs, my cost.
Whoa.
And, I got boxes of them all. I got to store them.
Mm-hmm.
I go to a spring manufacturer. I can't tell them, well, give me 100 of this spring. They throw me out.
Right.
So we have to do some kind of quantity, and I had to do some approximation. So I hoped that I provide enough basis that you can work around what we've provided. I can't afford, space-wise and business-wise, to make every spring Bally used. There's hundreds. Same thing for any of the manufacturers. These guys were pretty good. Gottlieb especially was very, very good about not reinventing the wheel. If they had something that worked, they stayed with it. And they used it up. If they made a change, they used it up, and they made a running change, but they used it up. And they documented that they made a change, but they used it up. They didn't throw anything away.
Okay.
I would imagine other manufacturers would do the same. And they might have improved something, and the part number changes. Why? I don't know why. We've lost that.
Yeah.
I can see. I can go to a Gottlieb print, and I can see the record of changes on a print. They changed the plating, or they changed the tolerance, or they changed this. I can guess at why they made a change, but I don't know all the answers. I don't know what the feedback from the field was. I don't know what complaints were coming back through the distributors, and so forth.
So there's a record of change where someone signed off on it?
Well, any manufacturer does that. It's called an engineering change level.
Okay.
All right, but if you go to a Gottlieb or anybody's print, there, in addition to the print, there's a series of boxes in the usually lower left-hand corner where they list the changes, the date, who approved them, and what the change was. And you can kind of, they're numbered, and then you can go to that little number on the drawing and see what it pertained to. They might have thickened the material. They might have had to change the thickness of the material because a certain material become unavailable. Or, they used to print, Gottlieb used to plate all their parts in this, what they call semi-gold. It was like a brass or bronze kind of plating in the 60s. Well, at some point they did away with that. Well, that means changing the plating call out on every part that they plated. So there's a plating call out change. So you can see that on the print. I have also here boxes of what they call record prints, and I haven't really digested them, but the record prints are the marked up print that then became the later print. And if I look at the record print, I might find additional answers as to why something was changed. I have that level of documentation for Gottlieb. I can only imagine that any of these manufacturers that were controlling their process had an equal documentation trail as to what they were doing and why. These guys are running businesses.
Yeah, I would
It was not a hobby for Bally to make stuff. If they couldn't make money at it, they didn't stay in business.
Right.
Same thing with Williams. Same thing with Stern. Any of the manufacturers.
Sure.
The level of documentation is astounding. I'm impressed.
Well, That's good. That speaks to a well-run operation.
Oh, yeah. And the piece that I don't have, and I never will probably have, is I don't, in all the documentation I've got, I don't have their business documentation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have what did it cost to make a game, how much were we selling it to the distributor for, how much was it retailing for.
Oh,
that stuff is
interesting.
Still something we don't have, and I don't know if it exists. So my comments are really on the technical side of the business, not the business side of the business.
Right. Yeah. So the Gottlieb archives didn't have the ledgers and so forth that did all.
I wouldn't expect them to be, and I don't know that they would want to share that with me.
Yeah.
It took me. Well, the original Gottlieb parts came here in about 97 or 98, and it took me till 2 years ago to get my hands on the archives. I had to kind of convince them, and they had to, they had to decide they weren't using them. Mm-hmm. I had access if I needed information from a print or a buy card that I didn't have. Someone would get it for me and send me a photo or a fax of what I needed, so I could get to a manufacturer or start something. Get a part quoted or whatever. Oh. But actually having the drawings here is much easier, and it took me until a couple years ago to actually get them.
So have you seen a speed up in turnaround on new parts production and those kind of things because of that?
It makes my life easier.
Yeah.
I still have to decide whether the part's economical to remake.
Right.
It costs a lot of money to do an injection mold. It costs a lot of money to make a quantity of any kind of part. Mm-hmm. While any part is possible, not every part is probable.
Right.
There's an awful lot of parts in a game. And so that's one of the other reasons why we're on the phone a lot of times, is we're finding an equivalent that will work for something. If Gottlieb made a coil with a brass sleeve in it, and they had one part number, and then they renumbered all their coils in the late 50s when they went to a nylon bobbin, does that mean I got to supply the part under both part numbers? No, I don't think so.
Right. They're interchangeable.
If I'm making a 5141 flipper coil, do I really have to go make some with a label on it that says 1546, which was the earlier version, but it's identical electrically and performance-wise? Most people will give me the benefit of the doubt. Make the new part. That's it. Yeah. No, I have people who want the old coil. They want their game to look old. They want the old coil. I understand that. Mm-hmm. But that has to, unfortunately, become a nicety instead of a requirement.
Right. Yeah.
If I have an old coil and you want one, I'd be happy to sell it to you. But to go out and get a different color label and to print the part number on the part a little bit differently and so forth is not likely to happen.
There's function and then there's aesthetics.
Yeah, well, first thing we try to do is make the games work.
Right. Yep.
I don't want people to have 200-pound paperweights in their game room. I want the game to work. Mm-hmm. I've always focused on little building blocks. People will call up and I had somebody call me up recently. He wanted to buy a shooter assembly for a Williams game. I said, why? Well, the ball won't go far up. I said, what have you done? Well, I haven't done anything. I just want to buy a new shooter assembly. I said, well, I think you need about a 60-cent sleeve. And your springs okay? Yeah, springs look all right. I said, well, how about a 60-cent sleeve instead of a $28 shooter assembly? Mm-hmm. He hadn't thought about it. He's a new, I'll use the word kid, new guy who's obviously in his 20s, and he likes to replace things. Mm-hmm. Drives me crazy.
Yep. If it's not broken or worn out.
Not broken, it's rebuildable.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we also run into lots of people, it's available, I want it. Well, I only got 3 of them left. If you buy that and you don't need it, someone is going to call me up and they need the whole assembly because it's been missing.
Right.
If you can fix your game for a few pennies, and it would be nice if you leave it on the shelf in consideration for somebody who really needs that part, because nobody's ever going to make this assembly again.
Right.
I happen to have 3 of them because I got lucky. And yeah, it takes up space on the shelf, but somebody is going to need that whole assembly because it's missing from their game. And I'm going to say, I've got one for you because somebody left it there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not today's mentality. If I can replace it, I want to. I have trouble with that.
I hear you.
I'd make more money if people would just replace everything. That'd be great.
Well, sure, yeah.
But I'm trying to think about the long-term viability of pinball. People are going to be maintaining these games for many years. People are going to need this, and people are digging up games that have more and more wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
The easy pickings are gone, and every game is a project game now because all the good stuff has been collected already.
Mm-hmm.
So the quality of what you start with for your repair is less than it was, let's say, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. Games that should have been, taken out in the back 40 and buried, or served as a source of repair parts for other games, people are trying to restore.
Mm-hmm.
Repainting playfields and repainting cabinets, stuff that we would never have even dreamed of doing. Game's worn out. Give it a break. It's parts for the next game. No, these are being brought back from the dead today. And I appreciate that, and it's great.
Mm-hmm.
But those games are no longer donors of parts, they're requirers of parts, and they tend to require more parts because they're in more worn-out condition.
Yeah. We've kind of brushed over bingos, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on bingos in general and what effect they had on pinball.
Well, I appreciate bingos, and I appreciate what was done with them, but as a pinball collector, I don't have a very warm spot in my heart for them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's a lot of skill compared to flipper games, although people that play bingos will disagree with me, and that's fine. They have presented real legal challenges to flipper pinballs, especially in the 50s, that almost cost flipper pinballs their lives. So I think from that standpoint, I'm not enamored with bingo games. But that's my personal feeling. It's not everybody's.
Sure.
And I respect people who want to collect them. I'm glad their people are saving them. They're part of coin-op history that should be appreciated. But they're not my cup of tea. And I've worked on them, and I've worked on one-ball horse race games, and I've worked on all kinds of stuff. They're a different animal.
Are they? Did you find them enjoyable to work on, or?
They're a pain in the ass. They're pain in the. They're the kind of thing. I mean, I heard Don Hooker give a presentation at one of the early pinball expos. The complexity of a bingo is so great that the only way you can test them is with a machine. You can walk up to a mid-60s Gottlieb or Williams or Bally pinball machine, and you can play it and you can see whether it works.
Mm-hmm.
As a here, look for this, check for that, and you could become an inspector for a pinball company pretty quick. Right?
Right.
Drop coins in. Does this work? Does that work? You have a checklist. It's a very short checklist.
Mm-hmm.
Run a ball. Does it keep score? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, good enough. Out the door.
Right.
That's not the same for bingo. They have such intricate payout schemes and so forth. You can't possibly test them out. So they have to have machines to test machines. And it's just like working on slot machines. Once you understand how slot machines work, you understand that it's never in the player's advantage to be playing a slot machine. If the house is working on a 2% pay, the more money you put in, the more money the house makes.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting 2% of every dollar that's put in the game in the machine.
Yep.
I used to restore mechanical slot machines back in the 70s under the cloak of darkness. They weren't legal here yet, once you understand how they work and everything, and how easily you can change the payouts, and how you can add a bug or plug a hole, make this little adjustment, you lose all respect for what they are. I mean, you go to Las Vegas, and when you find slot machines in the men's room, you know exactly what they want from you. They want your money. That's fine. They're not hiding anything. I'm fine with that. But to sit there and play them for hours and hours and hours and hope to win is not likely to happen. You couldn't build a business on that. They have to make money.
Mm-hmm.
They're not in it for the goodness of their heart.
True.
Like Pinball Resource is not a public service. We have to make money to pay salaries and pay, overhead and, rent and utilities and phone and, health plans and all kinds of stuff like that. It's, I can't sell the part for what the part cost me.
Right.
But that's, but everybody knows that. You can accept that.
Yeah.
I don't keep it a secret. Same idea.
Yep. Steve, best way to get a hold of you if people need parts is via the phone, 845-473-7114, correct?
That's correct. And we do a lot of email the same way.
Mm-hmm. And
Jimmy's on our email, and he has kind of the same philosophy where we try to catch the bigger problems and straighten them out. And if it's something beyond the scope of email, then customers told, please call and talk to Steve. You got a motor to be rebuilt. You got to talk it through. It's best to do it that way. So we have, telephone traffic for that reason too, but email is very popular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very nice to be able to get your order set and send it in. I work on machines after work hours, so I do a lot by email with Jimmy, and that's a very nice option. It
works great for time shifting overseas too.
Oh, yeah.
Emails from people all over the world, and for them to call you up, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, in Australia, when somebody would want to call you here during business hours.
Right.
And I've had people call me from 1 o'clock in the morning. Oh, I just got back from partying. I had a good time. I need to talk to you about pinball parts. And you try to talk through the fact that he had a good time and his Australian accent and get him all straightened around. It's quite a challenge.
I believe it.
Yep.
So
we did it. It took a couple tries.
So this was an actual incident here.
Oh, yes. No, it happened rather recently. And then it generated an email that I then had to filter and say, no, that's not what we talked about. We did this. So I but it took a couple of passes.
I gotcha.
I still remember when we printed the Pinball Collectors Quarterly, and I ran Pinball Resource and the magazine, everything all out of my house. Right? And somebody got their magazine in the UK, and they called me up, and I answered the phone. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. They didn't even think about where they were calling. Yeah, okay. But that's, that doesn't happen anymore because I don't live here.
Right.
But
so, and aside from that, people can fax as well.
Yeah, we still have a fax machine. A lot of people seem to be taking them out, but we have a fax machine that's rather busy. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our suppliers need faxes.
Yeah, I work with insurance, and so we're one of those industries that still has a lot of fax going on. So that's
no, you don't want somebody to tell you on a phone or leave a voicemail to do something.
Yep. So that's good.
And we get orders written longhand in the mail.
Really?
I had one this week. Please send me this back glass off your specials list. Okay.
Huh.
Yeah, that's the way that person prefers to order.
That's really cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Filled the order and sent the back glass out. No problem.
So you take all comers, is what you're saying?
Carrier pigeons, all kinds. Post office knows how to get here. Most of the carriers are here on almost daily basis. So
Well, that's good. And
we get all the mail we're in a multi-tenant building, so we get mail for everybody, and if they don't know where it goes, it comes to me. So I get everybody's mail. So we get it. We get your mail if you mail it.
Very good. And my compliments to everybody at Pinball Resource. Everybody has always been very, very helpful. So thank you, Steve, for keeping that going, putting that together.
It's my pleasure.
And well, it's my pleasure to order from you. I mean, seriously, because it's
thank
fantastic.
you for your thank you for your patronage, and thank you for doing what you're doing, because I think you're recording stories and things that will encourage other people to keep pinball in their heart and carry. I get people call me up on the phone, and their fathers, and they're teaching their kid how to work on a game, or their daughter is now 2 or 3 and he's teaching them how to play and so forth. These people are what are going to keep pinball alive, for future generations.
Exactly.
And it's still a mechanical kind of a thing. It's not a blip on a screen, and that's kind of what makes pinball, unique. I hope it stays around for a long time.
Me as well. So, well, thank you very much, Steve, for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome, Nick. My pleasure.
And I'll be talking with you soon. I'm going to order that run of Pinball Collectors Quarterly with my next order.
I think you'll enjoy them.
I think I will, too. So, thanks again, and I'll put this contact information for Pinball Resource in the show notes, so people will be able to look that up in case they don't know it already, which I'm sure most people do, but just in case.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. I want to thank my guest Steve Young for coming on the show. Be sure to go to pbresource.com for more information and some of the common parts that they carry, as well as some oddball stuff that they may have from time to time. As I mentioned in the interview, their contact info is going to be in the show notes. And that's all for tonight. Thank you very much for joining me. My name again is Nick Baldridge. You can reach me at foramusementonlypodcast@gmail.com, or you can call me on the Bingos line. That's 724-BINGOS1, 724-246-4671. You can listen to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Casts via RSS, on Facebook, on Twitter at Bingo Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram, also at Bingo Podcast, or you can listen to us on our website, which is foramusementonly.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.